It's time for another thought experiment. Today, we're going to unravel the tapestry that is Star Trek Voyager by asking, what would have happened if Captain Janeway had used the caretaker array to get her ship home at the end of the first episode?
Alternate Trek history.
The universe is as we know it, up until the caretaker dies. Janeway realizes she can both get some of her crew home and destroy the caretaker's array. They first have to fight the Kazon a while longer and lose a few more crew members. Let's say Joe Carey was never coming home from the Delta Quadrant. And Chell doesn't make it either. Oh, Chell, alas, we would never know your red alert chili. Once the immediate battle is over, Kathy beams a tri-cobalt device onto the array with a timer and uses the caretaker tech to send them back. It's the best of both worlds. At this point, we have two blocks of timeline changes. Things that happen differently in the Alpha Quadrant because of Voyager being in Federation space for 7 years, and the things that didn't happen or happened differently in the Delta Quadrant. We'll tackle the Delta Q stuff first. I've chosen to leave out some of the more minor interactions Voyager had in its 7 years in the Delta Quadrant, but have tried to surmise how things may have changed due to a lack of Captain Kathy on her whirlwind tour. Let's start with something I don't think changed at all, and that's the ultimate fate for the Ocampa. After their energy runs out, they're still left at the mercy of the Kazon on a planet that can't grow food. I'm not sure why either Janeway or even the caretaker thought they were doing something good in the name of the Ocampa. What would still largely be the same is the Kazon and Trabe as never-ending enemies, and there would just be some different power dynamics that play out without Voyager's intervention, though there is a Kazon boy somewhere that never gets his name. The first big difference would come in the unnamed planet from Time and Again that wouldn't have gotten a second chance through time shenanigans to rethink their use of polaric ions as a power source. The 37s remain in their cryostasis, and their genetic descendants never meet other Earthlings. On the really tragic end of things, a huge part of Rikosa 5 would have been wiped out by the Dreadnought missile, without B'Elanna destroying it in the nick of time. One of the things that has the widest range of implications comes from not finding the Q Quinn imprisoned in a comet. In this timeline, he's still suffering yet existing in that comet. Humans never get a look at concepts of the continuum, and more importantly, the Q Civil War never happens. The Q don't wipe some of themselves out of existence, and likely save some lives in the galaxy as well. While it was never explored in the Q and the Gray, I can't imagine that all the supernovas that happen as a result of the war didn't have negative consequences for the races in the Delta Quadrant. Badian Dr. Dinara Pell would have died quietly in space, forgotten about. The small group from the Thaw would live out the rest of their lives in the frightening simulation of their own unintended creation. The Ferengi, Arador, and Cole would remain the de facto god emperors of the Takarians, which forever changes the society into hyper-capitalists, even after the two are gone. The Anarans forget their fascist roots and learn nothing from the mistakes of their ancestors. When it comes to the events of Future's End, it at first broke my brain trying to figure out how, or even if the chicken and the egg thing would play out. Shout out to my dude Windgrace from the channel @Windgrace Project for pointing out that the Delta Quadrant itself had nothing to do with Voyager being caught up in this time paradox. And their starting point could just have easily been Beta Z. So we're going to assume that it plays out similarly, but with more difficulty figuring out how to stop Starling. Janeway wouldn't have the advice of 20th century aficionado Tom Paris to help guide certain parts of the mission, and the Doctor wouldn't have been their primary physician, and would never gain a mobile emitter. Nor would Neelix and Cass have ever been exposed to space soap operas. Speaking of Neelix, his friend Wixaban probably would have ended up in cryostatic prison for his illegal narcotic trade at the edge of the Necrid Expanse. The XBs from Unity wouldn't have had an event to help them bring harmony among the former Borg, and would have eventually wiped each other out for resources. The Nizu from Rise would have been displaced by the Atanian Order without Voyager interfering in their asteroid warfare plot. The Nerians would continue abducting and taking over ships and colonies without the Voyager crew's innovative intervention in their shenanigans. The war between the Borg and species 8472 would have played out quite differently. While the Borg sold Janeway on the idea that they were losing the war, I don't think that would be the ultimate end, considering the Doctor's weapon was made up of Borg nanoprobes. And the Borg are highly adaptable, so I think they would come up with that solution on their own eventually. The hive mind would probably come close to collapse and throw hundreds of billions of extra Borg at the problem before declaring victory. They would end up in a rebuilding phase and likely would not trouble the Alpha and Beta Quadrant powers again for centuries, but it wouldn't be basically the end of them as we see post-Endgame in Picard's third season. Unfortunately, 7 of 9 never would be reclaimed, and likely lost in the Borg's costly war. Anarax, if left to his task, probably would have kept messing with time and space for eternity in a vain attempt to return his family to the timeline, even though it seems as though he's angered the Time Lords and was on a futile task. Given how fed up much of his crew was by the time Voyager entered Krenim space, I don't think they would have allowed him to go on more than another century doing what he was doing, though. The Hirogen would likely continue spreading out and eventually leading their race to extinction through lack of forethought, living for the hunt and nothing else. This next thing might be the most consequential effect of Voyager's lack of intervention. The unnamed race from the Omega Directive would likely have eventually lost control of their Omega molecules as they already partially had when Voyager encountered them. This would have made a significant part of the Delta Quadrant a warp wasteland, preventing trade and exploration. The quadrant as a whole would stagnate and become a mystery to future Federation explorers trying to map the galaxy as to why they can't achieve warp through most of the quadrant. Another similar catastrophe on a smaller scale would take place in the Malon's quest to make their radioactive isotopes other people's problem. The void race at night would have been wiped out, and systems over multiple light years would become irradiated from the freighter that lost control in Juggernaut. The racial struggles of the Kyrians and Vaskins would take longer to come to a boil without the Doctor's backup copy to light the match, but also turn into a worse all-out war between the two again, who still fall back into an uneasy situation without the Doctor to guide them through their post-riot struggles. They probably end up in this loop of unease and war every few hundred years. The Bernari telepaths in Counterpoint are captured in the Devore trap, never to be seen again. Nas would have been removed from existence along with the other aliens in the pocket dimension from gravity. The silver blood from Demon would never have gained sentience, but then neither would it have died in deep space, being only a footnote in the real Voyager's log. Like Future's End, the events of relativity may very well have played out similarly. Kathy has a propensity for getting herself and her crew into time shenanigans, and I have a feeling this would have continued in the Alpha Quadrant, forcing Braxton to clean up her messes and still getting frustrated. The biggest difference in this scenario is that Janeway herself probably would have been the one selected to find the bomb and apprehend Braxton. The angry AI warheads from Warhead that were supposed to have been recalled would have reached their target and destroyed the bulk of a planet that wasn't even at war anymore. Just because Kathy and crew didn't suffer in the Delta Q for 7 years doesn't mean the Equinox wasn't stuck there for at least 6. I tend to think the beings they'd been abusing for fuel would have gotten to them before they got to the Alpha Quadrant, as they were pretty dead in the water when Voyager found them. They just become another forgotten lost ship. A small positive for the quadrant comes as the Vaudoir would have remained in stasis and not caused their neighbors additional irritation hundreds of years after their heyday of being a bully. It's hard to say how the species from blink of an eye would have developed. Without Voyager, they wouldn't have had to build their structures super strong because of quakes. That could have led to them getting into the galaxy earlier due to using their resources differently, or later because they didn't learn to build stronger stuff. But I'd bet they do become a spacefaring civilization with or without Voyager, and with the time difference, probably wouldn't be too different in galactic standard time before they reached the stars. The reminder of a long-ago war in Memorial would go silent without Voyager's intervention to recharge its power supply, and honestly, that might be a positive for all that passed by. The Borg kids may not have ended up in their predicament because the collective is now greatly diminished and may not have even assimilated Icheb and his bioweapon in the first place. If they had, though, I think the kids would have just faded into obscurity and never reconnected with the collective. Back in the Alpha Quadrant, Louis Zimmerman wouldn't have survived his terminal illness, since the Doctor never gained Delta Quadrant experience to help his stricken creator. Though diminished in numbers by the war with Species 8472, Unimatrix Zero remains a refuge for the Borg with special brain chemistry to tune in during their regeneration. The warring factions from the episode Drive would have a very short period of peace when the finish line bombing actually happens, which sends the various species back to a state of war. Speaking of Harry Kim doing useful stuff, the Kraylor would eventually fall to the Inari without getting cloaking technology back to their homeworld under blockade. The planet Quora would keep on brainwashing crews of passing ships into being their workforce for many years to come without Voyager's interference. Though I think some of the crew or a family searching for a lost loved one would eventually come forth and blow the whistle on them. Since Quinn was never released from the comet, Q never gets the idea to spawn a child, and Q2 is never a thing to stir up trouble through the universe. Friendship 1 is never recovered, and all the people on that planet eventually succumb to radiation poisoning. The Talaxians Neelix ended up staying with in Homestead are driven from their home in the asteroid belt with almost nothing and never find a new home to settle. That pretty much summarizes how the Starship Voyager changed the fates of many in the Delta Quadrant. Though some are better off for not encountering Voyager, many owe their very existence to a chance encounter with the ship from the other side of the galaxy, just trying to make their way home. Speaking of back at home, it's time to look at what Voyager and its crew might have done if they hadn't been stuck in the Delta Quadrant for 7 years. Right off the bat, Neelix and Kes remain in the Delta Q, living out her 9-year lifespan, but never reaching the full potential she did on Voyager. The Maquis were going to jail, even if Janeway stuck up for them after doing what they could to help in the mission to capture them. It's clear that the Federation would never let them go unpunished. I think Chakotay and Torres would have been imprisoned with Sveta until after the Dominion War was over. At that point, after time in New Zealand to think about it, the collapse of the Maquis, and a lack of capable seasoned officers in the wake of losses in the Dominion War, I think Chakotay would have gone back to be in Starfleet similar to Ro Laren, though he would never achieve the rank of captain as he was able to in the Prime timeline. B'Elanna likely would have drifted after her incarceration, getting into a fight wherever she could find it, never becoming a mother, but dying an honorable death in some random battle. Without Janeway and Chakotay pushing her to redeem herself, she never works through her mental struggles. The same can be said for her husband. Upon returning to the Alpha Quadrant, he's released as a Starfleet observer and cut loose. I think he ends up about the same as we see him in Non Sequitur. He just drifts as we see that he's willing to sacrifice himself for the cause of a guy that claims to be his friend in another timeline. In happier news, Tuvok's tactical prowess sees him go quickly up the ranks as the Dominion War escalates, where he likely comes out a captain due to the lack of available commanders by the end of the war. The disease he was afflicted with in the end of the Prime timeline never becomes a factor that affects him. The Doctor would have been deactivated and replaced by a fresh medical officer. Ultimately, he would end up transferred with his fellow EMH Mark Is to mining work, never writing the underground holo-thriller about a crew that mistreats their medical hologram. Despite Lower Decks teasing otherwise in its current season, I don't think Harry Kim is the forever ensign in all but one timeline. In fact, like Tuvok, I think he goes on to showcase his prowess at operations and engineering through the Dominion War, and comes out the lieutenant commander he mused he could be during the episode Nightingale. I don't think Janeway's ultimate fate would be much different than we see her in Prodigy. She's always felt like she's more of an admiral. Where Kirk, Picard, and Sisko were never meant to be admirals and forever captains, Kathy always seemed to be bucking for the next pay grade, and was never afraid of making morally questionable choices that other captains may have taken the high road on. It's fair to say that Voyager left one of the greatest marks on the galactic stage of any Starfleet ship ever. Thanks for watching this hypothetical situation. I'd love to hear in the comments below what other what-if questions you'd like me to tackle in the future. If you enjoyed this alternate Trek take, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Till I see you again, peace and long life.